My noble fellow questers after beauty and knowledge, my brethren, my bros, my dudes even, it is time to continue our journey of reading through the entire Silmarillion. Today we will be examining the Quenta Silmarillion Chapter 1, The Beginning of Days. As per my tentative plan of how these things are going to proceed, I'm going to summarize the events of the chapter with particular attention to how the chapter functions within the structure of the published book titled The Silmarillion, and also how its contents relate to the rest of the Legendarium. In addition to that, I will be looking at how this part of the story changed throughout its different drafts and versions. And sort of as I go, I will be making thematic commentary on anything that particularly caught my eye. So with this first chapter of The Beginning of Days, we have now moved fully into linear time and roughly three-dimensional space, and stuff actually happens in this chapter, like, sequentially. Although it's also true that the second half of this chapter gets a little weird still. I will be getting into all that. Additionally, this is the first book of the Quenta Silmarillion, as opposed to the Ainulindale and the Valaquenta that we've looked at earlier, but we're still dealing with the fact that the time frame for this chapter is pre-elf, and since the elves are supposed to be the authors and are the focal characters of the Quenta Silmarillion, the events of this chapter are still supposed to be what has been reported to the elves by some of the Valar, which means they still feel overall very remote. So in the course of the first couple of paragraphs, we are informed about the wars at the beginning of Arda, which are discussed in just a few sentences here, even though they must have been literally titanic in scope, probably encompassing several thousand of what we would call solar years at the least. Another influencing element here is the unavoidable fact that we have just read about different versions of the primeval titanic conflict between Melkor and the other Valar in the Ainulindale and also in the Valaquenta. For instance, the Valaquenta has this lovely, vivid description of how Melkor descends from splendor into darkness with fire and wrath and burning. And at the end of the Ainulindale, there are further details about his initial conflict with the other Valar over who gets to be in charge of Arda and how exactly he goes about ruining their work and their labors. So from those earlier sections, the reader already kind of knows what's going on. There's no need to rehash too much of this. Also within the first paragraph or two, we hear about the arrival of Tulkas, which is another example of something we've already heard about in more detail. But it's told with a different emphasis here. It kind of hits diff when it's told as part of a story instead of being included as a description of, for example, Tulkas in the catalog of the description of all of the other Valar, which is what we saw in the Valaquenta. Even though it's a very abbreviated arc, there is still sort of an arc here. There's this sense of suspense when we're hearing about how frustrating and stressful it is to deal with Melkor ruining all of the Valar's efforts, and then this triumphant resolution where, oh look, here comes this handsome stranger to save the day, and his arrival is what turns the tide of war and enables the Valar to overcome Melkor and cast him without the circles of the world. Personal aside here, I love Tulkas. He is a Sigma male gigachad, paragon of non-toxic masculinity. He's just great, and this is really the only point at which it makes sense to call attention to that. So proceeding right along, with the arrival of Tulkas, Melkor loses this vaguely described conflict. He gets kicked out of Arda entirely for the time being, so he's Melkor in space for a while. And the Valar get to work on shaping the world, which naturally leads to the question, what shape exactly do they give it? Is it flat or is it round? Or did it change from flat to round? Or was it always round, but sometimes it could be perceived as if it were flat under the right circumstances? Is this a geocentric universe or isn't it? What even are the encircling seas? Don't worry, we will get into it. A little bit. But for the time being, for this specific chapter, we don't get that many concrete details about the physics of Middle-earth, which I suspect is a product of not only authorial discretion, but also editorial discretion. The more vague they can make a description, the less chance it has of flagrantly contradicting some important detail in a more developed version. It's also true that those details like understanding the different layers of the atmosphere or the geometric shape of the world are not really the point of this story, either from the point of view of the elves who would be receiving it and recording it and passing it on, or from the men who would be receiving it. What is necessary to establish is that the Valar make a very pretty, beautiful, lovely world. It's one that can support life, and in this account, the Valar are the one to give the world its first lights, which are the lamps of Iluin and Ormal, these giant pillars set at the north and south of the world, and the place where the light of those two lamps overlaps is the best place, which is a common theme in Middle-earth, where the lights of different flavors tend to mingle, is always the best and most beautiful. So that is where the Valar make their first dwelling, the island of Almaren, where everything is very lush and green and primordial and Edenic, and more importantly, symmetrical and harmonious, and according to the narrative, perfectly suited to what the needs of the forthcoming children of Eru would be. It's interesting to contemplate this perfect, peaceful paradise of a world when you know that several of the Valar appear to have a certain grimness or darkness or even violence that's inherently part of their very nature. Like, what is Mandos doing during this period? Is he just sitting in a cave somewhere, preparing his list of cryptically prophetic statements? Is Nienna busy trying to teach pity and patience to the giant ferns and crying a lot and everyone's really uncomfortable about it because nothing's really gone wrong at that point? It's unclear. Regardless, the Valar hold a feast when they've gotten everything more or less set up the way they like it, and Tulkas and Aule in particular are exhausted because they've been working to help everyone else during this time period. We hear that Tulkas espouses Nessa during this feast, and then after he espouses her, he falls asleep. This whole time, Melkor has been in space, summoning his space Balrogs and other demonic followers, and when the Valar let their guard down, he sees it as his chance and sneaks back into Arda. He hides behind the shadows cast by the lamps, he goes north and he delves Utumno, which is his first stronghold, and he starts spreading corruption from there. Now, obviously, the Valar notice this corruption, and they make preparations to hunt him down and confront him, but while they're working on that, Melkor makes a preemptive strike, he topples the lamps, and this leads to horrible global destruction, and the Valar become so distracted and absorbed in trying to salvage something that's at least habitable that they can't really spare the attention to deal with Melkor. And once they've restored some semblance of order, they retreat to the westernmost landmass, which is called Aman, and they create the realm of Valinor there. They fence it with extremely high mountains to the east to keep Melkor from sneaking up on them, and then they focus their work on beautifying the land in this one area and building their respective halls and permanent dwellings. So because of this intensive work, Valinor becomes even prettier than Middle-earth as a whole was during the Spring of Arda, but the problem is the rest of the world, that is, the vast majority of the world, is still really screwed up and it's more or less at Melkor's mercy. And some people are more upset about this than others. The last big event in this chapter is that Yavanna creates the two trees, Telperion, the Tree of Silver, and Laurelin, the Tree of Gold, and these give light to Valinor. The two trees also cycle. Each one blooms for 7 hours and then goes dormant for 7, and when the one goes dormant, the other one gets brighter, and for each cycle there are 2 hours where they overlap. So one where Telperion is waning and Laurelin is waxing, and then one where Laurelin wanes and Telperion waxes. And during these twilight hours, the light is very soft and equal parts silver and golden, so the mingling of the lights becomes a very beautiful and almost a sacred hour in Valinor. The other thing about a repeated regular cycle like this is that it gives the Valar a concrete way to measure time, and that's actually called out in the text as now they know what a day is, and now they can begin counting the days, and this is where recorded time is really a possibility. And this is also in the name of the chapter, which is something I didn't actually realize at first. I thought the phrase beginning of days was just a poetic reference to how early this period is, kind of like the stock phrase at the dawn of time. So it's not just that this chapter is telling us about stuff in the distant remote past, like, oh, once upon a time, in the beginning of days, long, long ago and far, far away. I mean, that's true enough, but it's also actually like, here is where the unit of time known as the day got its start. Like, literally, this is how days began. So just on the off chance that someone else out there is like me and not realizing the significance of... So to finish off the chapter, we get a few comments on life in Valinor, the status quo as it stands until the point where the elves arrive, the state of the rest of Middle-earth, where Melkor is having a grand old time, not having to worry about the rest of the Valar, because they've all run away. And then we transition into some passages that describe specific Valar, particularly the ones who will be most closely associated with specific peoples and clans of the elves. So we talk about Aule, who will be concerned with the Noldor. Then we talk about Manwë, who is most beloved by the Vanyar, along with his wife Varda, who's an important figure to all the elves. And then Ulmo, who is associated with the Teleri, but is also just a particularly merciful and faithful Vala to the children of Eru in general, and who, it's emphasized, never forsakes Middle-earth, no matter what. And this leads into a discussion of Yavanna and Orome, who are particularly concerned with trees and animals and nature, and so they actually visit the Outer Lands somewhat regularly even after the establishment of Valinor, and they are worried about their work getting messed up by Melkor. So even now they are taking steps to combat or slow down Melkor's corruption, and they've also started urging more direct action against him, even though no one else is particularly keen on that yet. So this section concludes with the statement, "Now all is said concerning the matter of the earth and its rulers in the beginning of days, and ere the world became such as the children of Iluvatar have known it," which, as we will see later, is a drastic oversimplification. If only that were the case, but it's not. And instead of the chapter ending there, it then goes on to this somewhat oddly placed little snippet on the differing fates of elves and men, and the gift of men, which includes a fast forward to Melkor's attitude toward men, who of course he hasn't actually met yet because they don't actually exist, because the elves don't actually exist either. And the reason I say that this is oddly placed is because supposedly in this chapter we're supposed to be in the Silmarillion proper. We're supposed to be within Arda. And so we've transitioned somewhat out of the purely mythic or poetic mode of the Ainulindalë, and we're into something that's like history, albeit history at a far remove. Like the name of this section is Of the Beginning of Days. So even the chapter title is signaling that this is our transition into history as such. And then all of a sudden, at the end of the chapter, we're back in the, quote, timeless halls with Eru, except that this is a comparatively specific time within the timeless halls. They say it's about an age after the Valar have descended into Arda, where he's describing how the fate of men will differ from that of the elves, and what specific gifts men will have. And all of this raises the question, if this is an age after the Valar descended, then how do they know about it? Like, who told them this? Did Tulkas catch them up on all the juicy gossip when he descended into Arda late? I know that we already have to accept that within the story, everything that happens before the account of finding the elves at Cuiviénen is intended to be read as if it's coming through several layers of hearsay. But even then, it's still a weird little blurb. It seemed particularly jarring to me, this read-through, in the way that it broke the narrative flow that we really had only just established. And I also couldn't figure out why this section needed to be included here. I mean, except insofar as it's the sort of backstory comments that readers are eventually going to need to know if they're going to make sense of things, but it's not going to be relevant for several chapters yet. So if that's the case, then why not just weave this information in as it becomes relevant? like in the chapter on the coming of men or something like that. And maybe I wouldn't be getting so stuck on it except for the coincidence, if coincidence indeed it is, that it fits really well with the subject of this little digression, which is men and their fate and their gift. The idea that it's describing how men uniquely can transcend the music of the Ainur, which is as fate to all else, and the corollary, which is that they aren't of Arda as fully as the Ainur and the elves are, and they can't be at peace within it, and eventually they have to leave it sooner rather than later, according to the count of all of the other incarnate species of Arda. Elves, dwarves, even hobbits, and obviously the Maiar and the Valar. So if we think of the history of Arda as being a story, with Eru as the sort of ultimate author, and men being conceptualized as if they can transcend whatever narrative is laid out for them, it kind of works that the description of that particular power of men should be this moment that breaks out of the linear sequence and takes us back to the timeless halls for a second. I'm not prepared to argue that this could have been an intentional move on the part of either the author or the editor, but I am going to say that it's not inapt, like it's sort of fitting. More pragmatically, I think the reason this is included in this chapter is because in earlier versions, there are 2 additions to this chapter or section that are very natural inclusions at this point in the narrative. One is the description of, I guess, the Maiar, who are a much more diverse-seeming group in the early days, and how the Maiar are not elves, even though it may seem like it at times, because the Ainur and the children of Iluvatar have very different natures, and then it kind of describes a little bit how elves differ from Ainur, which then leads into how men differ from elves, and the main thing, of course, being their different fates. And secondly, there was kind of a more fleshed out afterlife progression for both elves and men, and the Valar were much more involved in storing and judging and shunting around the souls of the deceased. So the specific locations where that activity took place were naturally included in a description of all of Valinor. But then, as we see here, I think if you retain the discussion of where men go when they die, but where men go when they die has now been changed to be like, we don't know, they disappear, they depart the world entirely, it kind of loses its relevance to a part of the story that's describing and laying out how Valinor works. Like, well, now a discussion of mortal afterlife is irrelevant to that, but we're gonna keep it in the same place. So I don't know, that's just kind of a possible, more pragmatic explanation of why this is here. So now I'm going to take a look at how we got to this particular version of Chapter 1 of the Silmarillion, and all of the ways it could have been different, and indeed the ways it has been different before we got to this point. We've already seen the Ainulindalë, which was always a separate text from the Quenta Silmarillion, one of the few examples where Tolkien appears to have worked from draft to draft, instead of just starting totally from scratch. We've also looked a little bit at the Valaquenta, which was originally part of the Quenta Silmarillion until very late in the game, when Tolkien decided to separate it out, and it was retained as such by Christopher Tolkien. But now we are in the Quenta Silmarillion proper, reading a section which has always been intended as part of the Quenta Silmarillion. And fittingly, this transitional chapter is also a transition of genre, in that it's a sort of blend of myth, history, description, theology, and sprinkled with a few other genres just for fun. Something else that I find frankly kind of hilarious at this point is that in every single version of the Legendarium, from the 19-teens all the way through the 1950s, we open with a description of how the world was made, so okay, pretty standard, and then we're told that it was originally made in a way that's different from how it was when the elves awoke, and that is in turn different from how it became later. So it's pretty common with origin stories and creation myths to include at least one narrative of how once the world was like this, and now it is some other way. But it still feels like it happens very frequently in Middle-earth, and each time it happens there are very drastic consequences. Like, this is a world that transforms a lot. And not just transforms in the sense of kingdoms and realms, or islands and continents even rising and falling, but things like the entire three-dimensional shape of the planet, and what planes of reality can you even find certain locations, and where does light and energy even come from in this world? And what is the nature of light? Are there multiple natures of light? These are things that undergo multiple transformations in every single version of the story of Middle-earth. We're not just talking about point A to point B, we're talking point A to point B to point C to point D, even before we get sentient incarnates to comment on those changes, and then from there it's D to E to F to G to H. Like, it's a lot, is what I'm saying. On top of this, my research has suggested that these early days of the Legendarium are a part of the story that gets rehashed, revised, and restarted frequently. Not just in the works that I've been calling part of the Silmarillion proper, but also in the very early and the very late, sort of undifferentiated versions. So, for example, Book of Lost Tales material, and also Myths Transformed and Peoples of Middle-earth material. And partly this could be due to Tolkien's work habits that I've talked about earlier. He has this tendency, it seems, where he gets halfway through revising or rewriting an earlier incomplete version of his history, and then he'll stop, there will be sort of a hiatus, and then at the end he will start the whole work over again from the beginning instead of continuing on to the furthest part that he reached. And I mean, I do that a lot too, so I'm not judging, I'm just saying that it results in a proliferation of beginnings and a relative shortage of satisfying endings. The other, rather more rational reason for why this phenomenon takes place is this origin myth obviously is where Tolkien is describing the parameters of his secondary reality. And we know that for Tolkien, establishing a believable secondary reality is kind of the point of a work of art, particularly fiction, at least the kind that he intends to make. And moreover, the plot of that story needs to be believable and fit perfectly and seamlessly within the secondary reality itself. So that means that the kinds of stories Tolkien wants to tell in this world will only have their intended effect if they mesh well with the rules of the world they are set in. Now, we know he's already got an idea of what kind of stories he wants to tell, because those discrete legends are some of the earliest and most consistent parts of the whole Middle-earth project. So this brings us into a consideration of the round world, the flat world, and the potentially problematic fact that the story we read here is, according to Tolkien himself in his later phases, what he calls astronomically absurd. So I dug into this problem a little bit, and in the process I had to unlearn some of my previous assumptions. So I had this perception that I think is pretty widespread but also not articulated fully very often, that there's this clean split between the way Tolkien is writing and thinking in this so-called early phase, where everything is very mythic, very concrete, and oriented around imagery and dramatization, and that contrasts sharply with the so-called late phase, where we see a more dry, scholarly approach and a lot more attention to philosophical, metaphysical detail, where readers tend to find it a little frustrating or disappointing how much time and effort and ink he spends on what seems to be an effort to shoehorn modern astronomy into what otherwise might be a perfectly functional myth. You know, he could have been actually finishing Of Tuor and His Coming to Gondolin, or the revised Lay of Leithian in that time. And by comparison, the Athrobeth Finrod Andreth, or all of the essays in Myths Transformed, seem like evidence of Tolkien declining into this period of endless distraction and digression and obsessive niggling, and like he's lost all sense of proportion. And again, was sort of my unarticulated and unexamined assumption. And I'm revising my thinking around that a little bit. Firstly, because I have now seen firsthand just how early on and how exhaustively Tolkien was engaging with questions about the nature of matter and the shape/shapes of Arda It's admittedly in a very different form, but it's definitely present and described in a fair amount of detail in the Book of Lost Tales. The Ambarkanta is another important piece written in that pre-Lord of the Rings phase, and it has a glossary of terms and multiple diagrams associated with it. It's quite a technical piece in its own right. So it's not like this was a new concern for him, is what I'm saying. It's a lifelong concern, so far as I can tell, that he had always been engaging with, just as much as he would with the royal family tree of the Noldor, or Baron's mortality, or the origin of dwarves. I also found an article by John Rateliff, who's, I'd say, a decently prominent scholar. He published The History of the Hobbit. I'll see if I can link to it, of course, but in the article he takes on the question of why it was that Tolkien couldn't finish the Silmarillion. He kind of evaluates and explores a lot of, again, those widespread but poorly articulated ideas and beliefs about the nature of Tolkien's work after the publication of The Lord of the Rings. It's not that he's attacking them or debunking them, but if I can use an intolerably lit major phrase, he's interrogating them, seeing what holds up and what might be an oversimplification or a claim that's been made with maybe more confidence than is warranted. And he comes back around to suggest that the round versus flat Earth question may not have been an irrelevant distraction, but was actually something Tolkien had identified early on as a problem that he would critically need to resolve. And Rateliff makes a pretty good argument about what some of the consequences of not resolving it would have been. So I thought it was pretty carefully thought out. I thought it was thought-provoking. Certainly not the last word that could be said on the subject, but I don't think that it's trying to be. It's just sort of adding some context and perspective. So that was a bit of a detour. Now to wrap up, I'm going to look at how the story evolved beyond the bugbear of the astronomical geological question. So in looking at this chapter as published in the official Silmarillion and the different forms that this part of the story took over time, there were some broader trends and then some smaller, more discrete shifts where important details changed. One thing you can say broadly about the Silmarillion's evolution as a whole, not just this chapter, is this progression where in the earliest stories and early poems in the Book of Lost Tales and other writing of that era, there's very descriptive, vivid, colorful writing. It has this sort of artificial, archaic style, almost a little affected maybe. And so we don't just get, for instance, the news that the Valar build their mansions in Valinor. We get each mansion described in detail, including the color scheme and who the neighbors are, the choice of roofing material. It's very meticulously described and very visual, almost I would say emphasizing the visual over the narrative. The next sort of phase is these very compressed resumes or summaries, the first of which is aptly titled The Sketch of the Mythology. And Tolkien initially got that together for people who were critiquing his longer poems, like The Lay of Leithian, Lay of the Children of Húrin, that kind of thing. And he had to send them the context and the backstory, so it's really very bare bones. The early annals share this quality as well. And then through the successive versions, we get this gradual expansion into more detail and more elaboration and more emotion. But at this point, his style has matured into something totally different than where it started, particularly after the work he did in the writing of The Lord of the Rings. It's now something that's less whimsical, it's more restrained and dense, it has that remoteness and the sense of grandeur and gravity that people often talk about specifically with regard to the Silmarillion. So we start expanded, we contract, the style transforms, and then we expand back out, but often into something that's kind of morphed. It's almost like reading the work of two different people, which I guess in a way it is. Another observation that kind of applies to the first third or so of the Silmarillion is that despite the proliferation of all these different drafts and versions that don't have nearly so tidy a history as the Ainulindalë, this chapter and the early chapters are still similar to that work in that this is another place where the story stays remarkably consistent, especially when you consider all of the previously referenced behind-the-scenes angst about whether Middle-earth's origin myth could be sufficiently credible to scientifically minded readers in light of modern astronomy without losing its appeal and its central motif, which is really the two trees. Like, about the trees, it says, "Of all things which Yavanna made, they have the most renown, and about their fate all the tales of the elder days are woven." So they are central to at least the Silmarillion, and they kind of have to be important enough to justify it. But like I said, the outline of the story itself, with the progression of the Valar descending into the earth, their first attempt to light the world with two big pillar lamps, the lamps being destroyed, the Valar then retreating west to Aman, Melkor is wreaking havoc in Middle-earth, and then the trees are created. All of that has stayed pretty stable. In every version, the trees give light cyclically and include those hours of mingling where the one is winding down and the other is waking up. So the trees have always been the source of days and the count of time. The length of the day may vary, but the fact that it's due to these alternating cycles of tree glowiness does not. There's a lot of concern with light in the events of this chapter. Firstly, the whole world is kind of on fire, so it's like there's too much light, and then it's after the Valar subdue the fires that they realize now everything is too dark, so then they gather up light to put in the lamps, and then when Melkor knocks the lamps over, it spills the light, and then the Valar gather all store of light into Valinor. The trees are spilling and dripping light such that it can be gathered into vats. So there's this concept of light as being something almost liquid. It splashes around, it diffuses through the air and the earth, and you can gather it and concentrate it and even, store it. And that has always been the case, although it's comparatively downplayed in the later versions. In Book of Lost Tales, it's like the gods are just riding this tsunami of light. It's everywhere. It's getting on your shoes. It's very splashy. And a sort of corollary to this image is the idea that the Valar are actually able to gather and concentrate the light of the earth as a whole, I guess, in Aman. So when considering the Outer Lands and the rest of Middle-earth being in darkness during this period, it's not just that the trees are in Valinor and the light doesn't really reach over the mountains. I mean, that's true, but in addition to that, it almost suggests that in order to make Valinor what it is, make it so beautiful and holy, the Valar have collected and hoarded this actual very tangible resource, and maybe if they hadn't, Middle-earth wouldn't be so dark. So that's kind of an interesting, more implicit or unspoken critique of the Valar more or less leaving Middle-earth to fend for itself. And it's not something that gets, walked back, because again, it's part of that kind of fundamental image of how light works. So those are some of the bigger ideas that change or don't change over time. There's also a few smaller little tweaks that can be identified pretty easily. One of those tweaks is that in the Book of Lost Tales, there's no mention of Melkor being kicked out of Arda before the making of the lamps. He does fight with the other Valar, they're contesting over who's going to be in charge. Melkor does have to be subdued so that he'll stop wrecking everyone's stuff, and Tulkas is involved with that, but they don't throw him out into the void afterward. After the Valar kind of confront him, he talks his way out of it. It says, "Yet did he speak the gods fair, and say how he did scant harm, revelling only a while in the newness of the world. Nor, said he, would he ever seek to do aught against the lordship of Manwë or the dignity of those chiefs Aule and Ulmo, nor indeed to the hurt of any beside. Rather it was his counsel that each of the Valar should now depart and dwell amid those things that he loved upon earth, nor should any seek to extend his sway beyond its just boundaries." In this there was some covert reflection upon Manwë and Ulmo, but of the gods some took his words in faith and would use his advice, but others distrusted. And this is a big contrast with the later versions of the first wars in Arda, which are mostly recounted again in the Ainulindalë, and here they're just kind of summarized, but it's still relevant. The final version of the story has Melkor naming himself king of everything, and Manwë is the one who says, no, you don't get to boss everyone around, everyone contributes here and has an equal stake in the work. So Manwë becomes the defender of the other Ainur's rights and liberties against Morgoth's tyranny, whereas in the early version, it's almost a dualistic relationship where Manwë is authority and Melkor is rebellion, versus later where they're both claiming authority, but one is doing it legitimately versus the other doing it illegitimately. Another big change is how the lamps come to be destroyed. So in the first version of the myth, Aule actually asks Melkor for advice, because remember, he's still around and hasn't been totally shunned yet. And Melkor advises that Aule make the lamps out of this super cool new material he's just invented that's very translucent, great for lamps, and that material turns out to be ice, which of course melts, which Melkor knew it would all along, and that's how the lamps are destroyed and spilled. And then in most of the successive versions, which you'll remember are very contracted and compressed, the details aren't really spelled out, but there is this phrase that persists through a bunch of the different versions, pretty much down to around the time of the publication of The Hobbit, that says that Melkor destroys the lamps, quote, by deceit, which seems more like a summary of the original story than of the final one. So that idea, I guess, is sticking around for quite a while, but gradually the phrasing changes to say that Melkor overthrew the lamps. And then by the point that we're in Annals of Aman, we finally get that expanded account where Melkor sneaks back into Arda, having been thrown out of it, and overthrows the lamps violently by breaking their pillars and casting them down, so he's like physically destroying them and not just tricking people. So that lack of detail in the summary Silmarillions of the middle period make them ambiguous. It's hard to pinpoint exactly when in Tolkien's mind the old story entirely gave way to this new one. I think you could say that Overthrew the Lamps could arguably describe either version, so could Destroyed by Deceit. Clearly at some point it changed. And I think taken together these two changes are a reflection of how Melkor's character and really the whole conception of evil has changed. The problem is no longer that Melkor wants to overthrow legitimate authority, it's that he wants to usurp and exercise an illegitimate authority. So we go from seeing emphasis on what Christopher Tolkien calls Melkor's tricksiness, this rebellious quality that just wants to mess things up for the sake of it, a quality that even some of the Forgotten Valar argue might possibly have a balancing or a necessary place in the world, to the stress being put on how Melkor is this force of destruction that's purely envious and spiteful and more nihilistic. There is a subtle but noticeable shift over time in the circumstances of the Valar's retreat to Aman. In the earliest version, after the lamps are destroyed, this is really more of an inconvenience than a cataclysm. Everything becomes dark, and the seas are rising, and it's wet everywhere, and their island is getting soggy. Everyone's work is getting messed up, but I don't get as much of a sense of urgency about this disaster jeopardizing the very habitability of Middle-earth. The Valar make the decision to relocate more out of fear and frustration. They don't even try to confront Melkor about it, and it's actually after they retreat to Valinor that he's able to really go wild, do his most chaotic and destructive acts because there's no one there around to stop him anymore. There's also a description, I think it's in the Ambarkanta, that in the process of shaping Aman to be more protected and defensible, the Valar end up shoving some continents around. They want to make the western seas wider, and this causes land to then jut out on the eastern coast of Middle-earth. So it's not just Melkor. The Valar are also actively contributing to the world's symmetry being messed up. Pretty quickly, though, we see a shift to the idea that the Valar could not constrain Melkor. Either they didn't have the power to confront him directly, or they were so absorbed in trying to salvage something out of the chaos that they didn't have the capacity to then handle him too. We get the idea that they feared to rend the world further until they knew where and when the children of Iluvatar were supposed to show up, so being motivated more by a sense of responsibility. They could have addressed the root of the problem, and maybe they would have, they wanted to, but they were afraid to accidentally hurt or mess things up for the elves. We also hear the idea that Melkor escaped them, that they did actually try to look for him at first, but he was too sneaky, and he'd already secretly built his underground fortress. And that's another point where Melkor doing things deceitfully is very broadly applicable to all stages of the story's evolution. If he's not lying to the Valar and tricking them into doing things, he's still sneaking around and hiding himself in shadows, and that's deceitful in a different way. Concerning the creation of the trees, since of course they are trees, Yavanna always has a primary role in their creation. And in some versions, her sister Vanna is also named as one helping to water them as they come forth, which makes sense because Vanna is like springtime and sprouting and beauty. And in the first version of this story, the Valar are all kind of working together on them under Yavanna's direction. They actually dig big holes and they plant shiny things that they find. It's like when a little kid buries a piece of candy and then hopes that a candy bush is going to grow, except these are gods, so that when they bury shiny things, they actually do grow trees of shininess, which is pretty sick. Like, I want that power. In the short versions, again, brevity leads to ambiguity, but we either hear that Yavanna has made the two trees, or even more generally, the Valar make the two trees. And then, starting in the Quenta Silmarillion, the story starts to expand back out, but now it's in the different, more recognizable form. It's Yavanna who sings the trees into being, and the other Valar are present, but they're all watching kind of with bated breath. And the only other person who's playing a really important central role is Nienna, who's watering the mold with her tears. And by this time, Nienna has gone from being a gloomy, vengeful death goddess to being the Lady of Pity herself, and one of the great among the Valar. And I always feel like her involvement, while it certainly makes sense in retrospect, would have had to raise some eyebrows at the time, because at this point, we are in unstained Valinor watching the birth of the trees, and there is literally nothing to cry about at this point. So why do the trees need to be partly made of tears? Like, I would start to be concerned. I would feel that that was a pretty ominous decision, had I been present, which, of course, I wasn't. So I think that more or less wraps up what I saw in this chapter that was of particular interest. I'm very excited to finally have made it into the actual Quenta Silmarillion. We're dealing with a nice, sequential, unified narrative. I will say it was rather daunting to investigate how it evolved over time, but also in the end very satisfying. I feel like this process has really given me a new appreciation for not only the chapter as it stands, but also what lies behind and beneath it, and all of the decisions that had to be made to result in the form that we know best, and how the outcome could have been very different, and indeed, at times was very different. Thank you to everyone for your patience and for listening this far. I'd be curious to know where everyone else is sort of at in their engagement with this chapter. Is it like, oh, you hate it and you just have to get through it in order to get to the salty, dramatic elves? Or do you really enjoy it? Or do you wish that maybe some of those elements from the earliest versions of this tale had made it in? I, for one, wouldn't mind seeing more inter-Vala drama, hearing more about Valmar and everyone's different halls and their hobbies and pastimes. I don't know. I think that gives them a little bit more dimension and solidity, but that might just be me. Next up, of course, we will be looking at Of Aule and Yavanna, which promises to be a very good time. So until then, everyone, take care.